Now this be an unexpected delight.
Hello and welcome to another marvelous video. I'm your host Will. To me, my X-Men fans, in the latest episode of X-Men 97 Season 2, Gambit returns. And that's a problem, because his return was facilitated by Apocalypse, much like what happened in the comics. But there are a few differences that we will discuss today in today's video. Let's get to it, shall we? Even before the resurrection of Gambit in X-Men 97 Season 2, every comic book fan knew that Gambit would return as the Horseman of Death. But the 8th episode titled Dead Man's Hand changed that a bit. Instead of giving us Death Gambit, it turned the Cajun mutant into a sort of vessel for Apocalypse. And with that, Gambit went through not only a lot of changes from his former self, but there are a number of major differences between the comic book's Death Gambit and the Cartoon Gambit, who I'm now going to call Dark Gambit. And in this video, I'm going to explore all the major differences between Death Gambit and Dark Gambit. So without further ado, let's begin, shall we? Number 1. Initiation. We know that in the cartoon, Gambit was resurrected by Apocalypse as he wanted to turn this guy into a Horseman of Death, or potentially use him as a vessel for himself. So it's safe to say that Gambit did not really have much of a say in his predicament. But that wasn't quite the case in the comics, in which Gambit goes to Apocalypse out of his own free will. As of X-Men Volume 3, Issue 183, M-Day had come to pass, and most mutants had lost their powers. Only a total of 198 mutants remained in the US who still had their powers, and naturally, things were not looking good for anyone with the X gene. Amidst all this, Apocalypse made it known that he wanted to be mutant kind's savior, or at least that he would help level the playing field between humanity and mutant kind. How, do you ask? Well, his plan was to reduce each species to their 10%, and although his scribe, Ozymandias, notes that this would still mean that humans outnumbered mutants by hundreds of times, Apocalypse tells him that it's a symbolic figure. But then, someone enters Apocalypse's Sphinx, and lo and behold, it's Gambit. Apocalypse tells him how he had been expecting Gambit, which surprises the Cajun. Gambit tells him that he wasn't sure until very recently that he could, in fact, give himself and his allegiance to Apocalypse and his vision. But now, he's sure. You see, after M-Day, Gambit felt that these dark days that have befallen the mutants need darker ways to be dealt with, and no one wants to listen to Gambit. So he came to the one person who shared his vision, and Apocalypse feeds into this idea by telling Gambit that the other mutants are too scared to listen to him, and also that he was better than the rest. With that, the Eternal hands Gambit a test tube of the blood of Apocalypse to drink to a mighty partnership, and Gambit drinks it. Earlier in the same issue, it was revealed that Apocalypse's blood could stop the effects of horsemen like famine or pestilence, and one could go as far as to say that this blood basically served as a vaccine of sorts to the effects of the horsemen. So, as you can see, comic book Gambit had lost all hope in mutant kind when it came to securing themselves a future, and as a last resort, he went to Apocalypse to do something about the whole situation. But that wasn't the case with the Cartoon Gambit, who was a true X-Man until his very last moment. Number 2. Transformation. Even the transformation process of the two Gambits is pretty different. I mean, X-Men 97 didn't care to explain that part a lot, and the transformation largely happened off-screen. But the process was given a more detailed explanation in the comics, more specifically in X-Men Volume 2, Issue 184. The second story in this issue, which runs parallel with the first one by the way, sees Gambit go from a mutant to a true Horseman of Death. Gambit finds himself within Apocalypse's machine, one that was going to change his life, but he refuses all painkillers for his upcoming transformation. Apocalypse advises him to reconsider, especially since the first phase would require several instruments to burrow deep into his body. However, Remy insists that he had to remain conscious because he wanted to know exactly what Apocalypse was going to do to him, and Apocalypse does not give two shits about what kind of pain his soon-to-be Horseman would have to endure. So, he accepts Gambit's request, and tells Ozymandias that they would have no need for the Juice of Thoth. Remy then noticed a large instrument that resembled a pincer and asked what purpose it served. Apocalypse identified it as the Claw of Horus, although he later admitted that he did not fully understand its function. The transformation device apparently had a life of its own, which was about the least comforting answer Gambit could have received at that moment. Apocalypse casually suggested that the claw might have something to do with the lower intestines, and Remy could only mutter, "Right." Ozymandias used the opportunity to mock him. He was like the poets who would write about Gambit's courage for centuries because he had refused pain relief, and they would celebrate the brave man who had chosen Apocalypse's side. But Remy gets slightly pissed off at this, and he angrily replies that courage has nothing to do with his choice. More importantly, he had never said that he had joined their side. That response amused Ozymandias, who pointed out that Gambit could stare directly at unbearable pain, yet still tremble before his own motives. But in Ozymandias' view, Gambit had agreed to the procedure because he had grown to hate the X-Men. Apocalypse then tried to reinforce this idea, but with a slightly different approach. He told Remy that he had no reason to feel ashamed because someone like him deserved far more respect from the team. Before Gambit could respond, something began to dig into his back, and the fear on his face was more evident than ever. Apocalypse smiled and announced that the transformation had finally begun. He described tiny fingers that moved through Gambit's flesh toward the complex hieroglyphs of his spinal cord. Then he returned to Ozymandias' accusation and urged Remy to face the supposed truth about himself. According to Apocalypse, the X-Men had treated Gambit like rubbish. They had pushed him aside and stopped listening to him despite everything the mighty Gambit had offered them. Apocalypse touched Remy's face and argued that his unique heritage should logically have made him the leader of the X-Men. Then, in the middle of all that psychological pressure and physical torment, he paused because he noticed an odd smell. Ozymandias somehow managed to grin, despite the fact that his body consisted of million-year-old rock, and he proudly identified the scent as scorched flesh. An exhausted Gambit still found enough strength to tell Apocalypse that he was missing the whole point, and went on to explain that he had not entered the machine because he hated the X-Men. He had done it because he loved them. Remy admitted that he almost believed Apocalypse's claim that he truly stood with mutant kind this time. Something about the ancient mutant seemed different, and Gambit felt that M-Day had brought out the best in him. Mutants needed Apocalypse's strength, as well as his remarkable endurance and indefatigability, so Remy had accepted the risk because he believed that power could help their people. But at the same time, Gambit had never sworn allegiance to Apocalypse. He warned Apocalypse that if this new purpose proved false, or if the old schemes and selfish ambitions returned, Remy would be there to take care of the ancient mutant. Gambit's true intention was to watch every move and wait for the moment when Apocalypse revealed his true intentions. The machine suddenly did something else to Gambit, and another scream tore from him. Apocalypse then turned away and told Ozymandias to follow because he had to leave the device to complete its work. Ozymandias obeyed, although he reminded his master of Gambit's warning. He asked how Apocalypse truly felt about a fully empowered X-Man who intended to stand guard over him. Apocalypse merely smiled. Gambit might have believed that he could retain his purpose and identity, but those were the words of the man who had entered the device. According to Apocalypse, the creature that eventually emerged would no longer be that same man. As the two walked away and left the machine to finish the procedure, Gambit finally understood the real danger of his recent choice, and absolute fear spread across his face, which only meant that despite not taking the painkillers that Apocalypse was offering, Gambit was turning into a slave of Apocalypse. And that, my friend, is how Gambit in the comics turned into Apocalypse's Horseman of Death. Number 3. Working as Death Gambit versus working as Dark Gambit. In the 8th episode of X-Men 97, Dead Man's Hand, it was revealed that Gambit was actually serving as a vessel for Apocalypse's essence, kinda like the 2016 movie X-Men Apocalypse, in the sense that Apocalypse was looking for vessels in that movie. So the Dark Gambit we see and hear is actually not a resurrected Gambit, but basically Apocalypse within Gambit's resurrected corpse. Later on, after Rogue pulls Gambit's psyche or soul from Apocalypse, the ancient mutant kinda gets trapped within the consciousness of Gambit. As Dark Gambit, Apocalypse first takes the gem called Heart of Eternal Darkness from his former love External, also known as Kandra, and tries to turn Rogue into an immortal being, and as of episode 8, Rogue got all the powers that Kandra once enjoyed. But none of this happened in the comics. Now, Gambit's role as a Horseman of Death actually began in the 185th issue of the same comic series that I have been referencing. Rogue finally comes face to face with Remy LeBeau inside Apocalypse's Sphinx, although the man before her no longer referred to himself as Gambit. Apocalypse had transformed him into Death, his newest horseman, and claimed that Remy had accepted mutankind's need for a leader. But Death Gambit knocked Rogue onto the floor and held 1 foot above her face, which left her scared and confused. She asked whether he recognized her, but the blood-red eyes that stared back at her now had no warmth in them. Bobby Drake, aka Iceman, then came to her aid and hit Death with a surge of ice. Havoc agreed with Iceman that they had to treat this new Gambit as an enemy until they could restore the real Gambit. Rogue, however, remained certain that she had seen part of Remy behind those red eyes. When Iceman approached Death, Rogue begged him not to cause serious harm. Bobby promised to try, although Remy immediately grabbed him and slammed him to the floor. Nearby, Havoc exchanged attacks with Apocalypse, but Alex's power rebounded and struck a vast container filled with Apocalypse's blood. The vat broke apart and released the antidote within it. This meant that the antidote that Apocalypse was making could no longer be made. The liquid tore through the Sphinx wall before it poured across the Xavier Institute and its grounds. Anyway, Rogue made one final appeal to Remy and asked him to leave with her. But Death rejected the name Remy and insisted that his old identity was now futile. Rogue refused to accept such a response from the love of her life, mostly because she believed that some part of him still loved her. She argued that Apocalypse might have altered his body and damaged his mind, but he could not erase every inch of the bond that they once shared. But the word loved itself seemed like a foreign concept to Death, so he turned toward Apocalypse and asked his master about love. Apocalypse dismissed it as an emotional response with limited evolutionary value, then ordered Death to release his poisonous gas against Rogue. Remy obeyed, but Mystique leapt at him before he could complete the attack and knocked him down. Pulse then advised Rogue to accept the obvious and escape while she could. Rogue, Mystique, Pulse, Iceman, and Bling fled down an ice ramp that Bobby had created. Havoc also escaped after Ozymandias chose to remain inside the Sphinx. The servant believed he could hide within its countless chambers for years before Apocalypse found him. Oh yeah, Ozymandias had by now turned treacherous to Apocalypse. In fact, he was the one who led the X-Men to his former master. Moving on. Once Rogue reached safety, regret set in because she felt she had abandoned Gambit. But Iceman reminded her that the X-Men had survived worse situations and promised that they would somehow save Remy. And honestly, Rogue's faith proved correct almost at once. After the others left, Death admitted that his thoughts had begun to clear. He described the experience as a fog through which he had watched another person control his body. Beneath that altered form, he had finally recognized that he remained Remy LeBeau and Gambit, as well as Death, and more importantly, the part of him that loved Rogue had survived. Apocalypse refused to tolerate that idea because Death, in his view, could not love anyone. A horseman had to exist as a force of nature, much like a flood, an earthquake, or a desert storm. He then went on to grab Remy by the throat and threatened to return him to the transformation device for further adjustment. However, Apocalypse had given Gambit powers that made such threats far more dangerous for both of them. Remy warned him to let go or face Death himself, since he could convert the air within Apocalypse's lungs into poisonous gas. The threat did its job, and Apocalypse released him immediately. He still forbade any further talk of love and warned that another challenge would force Remy to prove what those powers could do. With much of the blood antidote gone, Apocalypse then ordered Death to follow him so they could revise their strategy. Apocalypse then visits the UN and asks the leaders to basically cull 90% of the human population or face complete extinction, cause his own plan to save 10% and kill the rest had been spoiled by the X-Men. The story continues after this, and Death Gambit basically leaves Apocalypse's side to join Mr. Sinister, as he promises him solutions to his problems. But that's not as important to understand the difference between Death Gambit and Dark Gambit, so I'll let that pass. Number 4. Power differences. In the cartoon, Dark Gambit had his powers increased in manifold ways, but he got another ability, that of turning anyone into his minions, which he then went on to use on many of his former guild friends and even X-Men like Nightcrawler. But as far as the comics are concerned, Apocalypse's transformation gave Remy a new appearance and a second set of abilities known as his Death Seed powers. Mr. Sinister supposedly removed Apocalypse's influence from him later, although the result was far from permanent. Remy's death persona and altered appearance continued to resurface at different points over the next several months. He had not reverted into death for quite some time, but the comics never explicitly confirmed that these additional powers had disappeared. His most disturbing ability allowed him to transform breathable air into poisonous gas. Death could create toxic clouds from the air around him, although he could also alter the oxygen already inside a person's lungs. I mean, Gambit normally needed cards or another object to attack, whereas this power allowed him to kill someone from inside their own body. Death also possessed a far more lethal version of Gambit's usual kinetic charge. Instead of causing an object to explode, this death charge allowed his cards to break down living tissue upon contact and completely disintegrate the victim. His death persona also appeared capable of controlling the path of those cards through mental commands, which made them much harder to avoid. Remy gained greater resistance to psychic attacks as well. When Death took control, Input's telepathic distortions could no longer deceive or distract him as they normally would. Finally, Death could corrupt other creatures and force them to obey him. After he used this power against Northstar and Dazzler, both characters began to resemble his death form, complete with pitch black skin and white hair. So yeah, that was all in this one, folks. If you can think of any other differences, do talk about it in the comments down below. And if you like this video, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these marvelous videos. Stay safe and have a good one. Excelsior!